Then there's California, a podcast featuring members of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus in conversations about their lives, their legislative priorities, policies, and other related issues that help make California exceptional. From the state capitol in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green. Even before the COVID pandemic, food insecurity, the lack of access to nutritional, healthy food, plagued the lives of millions of people here in the United States. And sadly, but obviously, food insecurity is often a proxy for economic insecurity and racial inequality, and thus hits some people and populations harder than others. Impoverished households and communities of color, for example, are at greater risk of hunger and malnutrition due to food access issues. Undocumented immigrant families are at a highly elevated risk of household food insecurity. And in particular, more than half of undocumented migrant and seasonal workers who work in the fields of California's agriculture communities are food insecure. And when you consider that there are more than 2 million undocumented immigrants in California and nearly 500,000 agriculture workers in California, that's a lot of hunger and potential malnutrition cascading through our cities and neighborhoods. And what a sad and shameful irony for such a rich and bountiful state as ours, that many of the same people working our fields and farms and orchards, working in our hospitals, taking care of our kids, struggle for access to the same food they harvest for the rest of us that benefits the rest of us. On this edition of Then There's California, we'll talk about this human rights challenge of food insecurity in this state and the vulnerable communities it affects, an insecurity that didn't start with COVID, but was certainly aggravated by it. And we'll have a conversation with a Central Valley lawmaker who, with her gifted combo of tenacity and empathy, is insisting California do a raw and honest reckoning about the fragile status of the nutritional, but also economic and social health of our most vulnerable populations, and find ways through legislation to provide greater food security, comida para todos, food for all, regardless of immigration status. State Senator Melissa Hurtado represents the 14th Senate District in California, which includes cities in Fresno, Kern, Kings, and Tulare counties. She's the chair of the Senate Human Services Committee. Senator Hurtado was born in Fresno, but has lived most of her valley life in the town of Sanger, where, prior to being elected to the state Senate in 2018, she served on the Sanger City Council. And the last time that Senator Hurtado joined us on this podcast, in the fall of 2019, she and I were in her district, standing right on the banks of the Friant-Kern Canal, talking about yet another insecurity facing vulnerable Californians, the lack of affordable and accessible water. Well, we're here in Sacramento at the Capitol for this conversation, and Senator Hurtado is with us in person. Welcome back. It's been a while.
Likewise. Thank you, Brian, for having me here today. But more importantly, thank you for allowing me the opportunity to share with California and really the world the challenges that the people of my Senate district and beyond face when it comes to food insecurity. And quite frankly, water insecurity and food insecurity go hand in hand. So I appreciate you bringing this to light through this podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you and your communities and the people in the valley have lived a lifetime practically over the last 15 months or so during COVID. How are you?
Well, Brian, I have to admit it's been an emotional roller coaster. The first thing that happened is that we went home, and the following day I began to get just amount of calls, a lot of different people that were just concerned and worried. And it seemed like things got gradually worse before they got even better. And I think that the whole idea behind food insecurity, I mean, it's something that traces back to the history of the region. But what made me think a lot about it, obviously, being in the Senate district and being home and seeing the long lines at the food markets, at the grocery stores not having enough food. But really, it made me think about what the Central Valley does, right? And that's food. We provide food to people all over California and to people all over the world. And it also made me think about the individuals that allow us to have these meals and how they were being left out of the resources and the food that they work so hard to produce. So it has been an emotional roller coaster, having watched them struggle and many others struggle. But at the same time, it's also motivated me. They motivate me. They are my motivation. They are what keeps me going every day to fight for all the injustices that this planet that we face and that we face there in the Central Valley region. So it's been an emotional roller coaster, but there's been some positives too. I'll add to that. I've also had over the past year, my entire family and we came down with COVID-19.
Wow.
And it was the scariest thing to, have to go through, but I also felt like we had to be mentally prepared to fight this on and make sure that family was protected and ultimately that we survived it.
Has everybody survived? Is everybody
yes,
okay? Good.
We're all good.
Good.
We're all good. But what came out of that experience was a wedding, surprisingly.
Wonderful. That's right.
My parents.
Your parents, yeah.
So my parents have been together for 30 plus years. They feel like marriage has been a bit of a curse. They didn't want to jeopardize the good thing that they had going on. And, of course, just time gets in the way, family gets in the way, and they just kind of left those hopes and dreams of getting married to the side. But it wasn't until, obviously this pandemic and having gone, getting COVID, but also just over surviving it, right? That they decided that they wanted to tie the knot.
And it was here at the Capitol, right?
Yes, it was it was really quick. We were all recovered, and my dad said, "I want to do it on February 6th. That's when your mom and I got together." And I said, "Dad, well, that's like 2 weeks away. I don't know if we're going to be able to pull something like that off." And so, sure enough, it didn't have to be something big. And the beautiful thing about it was that I was able to officiate the marriage.
Wonderful. In your capacity as an elected official,
yes,
right? Wow.
That's correct.
So a real blessing out of all of this heartache and ill health and fear, you had a healing moment with your family.
Absolutely. It was something that we needed, right? And long overdue and more than 30 years, and their children were there and their grandchild was there, and to them that's all they felt that they needed.
And they're on their way to forever together. So,
yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Congratulations to your family and to you as a daughter to be able to witness all of that. And you have brought up some really very important points here. Before we get into details, looking at the bigger picture, I think it's important to acknowledge and reflect on what has been a truly difficult couple of years for California's Central Valley. Your home, your beloved communities, your people, the raging disparities that COVID brought to bear, regardless of healthcare and livelihood, the access to water, as we've mentioned, immigration fears, and now once again drought. And here we are talking about food insecurity. The valley that I know and that some of my family grew up in, they're a resilient, faithful lot, but the human soul and the body can only take so much. So the collective body has really been through a lot the last few years.
Absolutely. As I stated earlier, it's been an emotional roller coaster for me. Mm-hmm. I can't even imagine the many other families and what they've gone through. And the resilient spirit of the region is unlike anything I've ever really come across. I've had the opportunity to meet with my Woman of the Year, who is a farm worker down in the Central Valley and in Kern County, and she spoke to me about the other side of the pandemic. We all talked about sheltering at home and not going out and protecting one another to curb the spread of the virus. And she said that in part what that created for her and her family was it caused her husband to get sick, actually, to the point where he ended up being hospitalized, not for COVID-19, but the lack of that physical activity of that normal routine created health issues that ultimately I had to amputate his leg.
Oh, my God.
But when I spoke to her and she was telling me all this, despite all of the challenges that she was facing, she was motivated for her husband, for her children. And her smile was always there. And that's the Central Valley. That's the people of the Central Valley. And like I said, we may have extreme hardships like the one I just shared, but we keep on going and we get back up on our feet and we fight every challenge that we meet.
This is inspiring to hear in spite of the tragedy and in spite of the pain. Let's talk about food insecurity, what it actually is. Hunger amongst our communities and families is hardly a new notion, but in California in 2021, it's taken on a more profound and, as you say, an even more urgent meaning, particularly for undocumented Californians. Explain food insecurity.
Well, food insecurity is the lack of having access to an adequate amount of food, nutritious food, but also just food that individuals like to consume, right? And based on culture, on preference, a lack thereof, I should say. Food insecurity in the Central Valley and really across the state of California and across the nation, it doesn't discriminate.
Right.
Food insecurity is something that anybody and everyone can really face. And it shouldn't be only those that don't have legal status in the states that are food insecure. It should be that everyone should have access to food, an adequate amount of food. But here in California, and what we saw through the pandemic is that food insecurity is very real in immigrant communities.
Yeah, I saw the stat that said 1 in 4 undocumented households are food insecure.
That is correct, yes.
Mm-hmm. And what's aggravated it? Obviously, it's COVID-related health issues, perhaps, but also job loss, food bank shortages and closures, even school closures, where kids who were able to get a meal from their school, some schools provided the meals even if they were closed, but a lot of them didn't even provide the meals. So all of a sudden you have children who maybe don't get the important meal of the day like breakfast or lunch at home and they're getting it at school, then it's not even available at school anymore.
Right, and I would say also just life too. Circumstances, right? Poverty, not having enough to make ends meet and having what is left over to provide for yourself and your family. It's going to work and just working all day, and sometimes there's just not enough food for perhaps your lunch, but there is for breakfast and dinner. Life gets a lot in the way of getting people the adequate amount of food and nutritious food that they need, and California needs to change that for all Californians.
You have said that food helps unify us. It bonds us together, our feasts and our traditions, and particularly to a community that you would say appreciates that as much as, if not more than many Californians, those traditions and those feasts and the food for every moment and the food for every holiday, that it means peace, it means opportunities.
Yes. Food means love.
Mm-hmm.
It means culture. It means the ability for people to come together to unite us. And when communities celebrate, for example, iftar during the month of Ramadan, they use food as to come together and enjoy. And so food, it has so much more to play in our lives than what we expect. And when individuals or families are food insecure, it's the complete opposite. Mm-hmm. Of what food actually means, right? Of all the good things that food actually means or should mean. It means that families are torn apart. When we have food insecurity, it means that there's a lack of understanding between individuals. It means that there's just more community tension and tension throughout the world.
Mm-hmm. You yourself have seen food insecurity close to home in your own life, right?
Yeah, part of the reason why I ran in the first place for city council, which is where I got my political career started, was because of a friend who, undocumented at the moment, and this was right after the last recession that really the Central Valley has never recovered from, mm-hmm. And she knocked on my door one evening and said, "Melissa, I need a few dollars to buy baby formula for my son." And it was the most difficult thing for me to have to go through because it wasn't just her. It was it was others around us that were all facing the same situation, the recession. It took a while for some to recover from, and others never really did in the Central Valley. But for her fear, being undocumented, being a single mother, and not knowing how she was going to provide for her child. She didn't come to my home asking for herself. She came asking for her child. Right. Her first concern was to get her child the food that he needed to survive. And it's something that I continue to think about as I do my work here in the legislature. It's something that I thought about even when I was on the city council, and I'll continue to do so because it's important that we provide food security for all individuals, because food security also means economic security.
Are you hearing the similar kinds of stories nowadays from people who are having those kind of food insecurity challenges to a person, who are talking to you at meetings and district gatherings, that kind of thing? When you talk about Comida para Todos?
Absolutely. It's still very much there, and especially now with the cost of food rising, individuals are having just that much more of a difficult time to purchase food, especially our undocumented community, because they don't rely on a program to feed themselves because they don't have access to these programs. And so they rely on the money that they make to purchase a meal. And nowadays you can't get a meal at an affordable amount. And so that means increasing food insecurity.
All right, Comida para Todos is your goal, food for all. Let's talk about your power of legislative influence in this process. You've authored a couple of bills related to food insecurity. You're moving through the legislature SB 464, the Comida para Todos Act. How will this bill provide greater food security to, in particular, low-income immigrant workers, immigrant families?
By giving them the opportunity to apply for the program, CFAP, that all other individuals that are documented in California, that they have access to. So when they need additional funding for food, they're able to get resources through like CalFresh program and provide for themselves and their families.
Well, let's talk about CalFresh. It's the program that provides access to food for documented folks here in California. CalFresh enrollment actually has surged more than 10% since the start of the pandemic. But CalFresh, the way I'd heard it, treats undocumented immigrants here in California as essentially invisible. They can't qualify for it.
Yeah, that's exactly it. They don't qualify. And my bill, SB 464, would allow undocumented individuals to apply for this program. And my goal is to make them food secure.
You and your colleagues in the legislature were trying to get the Food for All budget request into the latest 2021 state budget. And any luck with that, getting that money in?
Yeah, we've had some luck. We were able to get $5 million from the general fund in 2021 budget, and then $25 million general fund from the 2022-2023
wow,
budget.
So it's going forward. Great.
It's moving forward,
Good.
And that's
Wonderful.
what we're looking to do. We're looking to lift families out of poverty by making them food secure through SB 464, and there's funding in there for that. But ultimately, my goal is that they don't get ever to a point, any family, to become ever food insecure. Nobody wants to be in that place, right? And so the goal is to lift families ultimately out of poverty, but provide them with opportunities. We need to provide opportunities to our most vulnerable communities.
You have also authored SB 108 that would require California government agencies to consider human rights to food as they create, amend, or adopt regulations in the future. And it will also require a reporting on the current and future status of food and food production and food assistance. So give us some more details on SB 108.
Yes. So I know I mentioned earlier that water security and food security go hand in hand.
Right.
And as we like to say in the Central Valley, food grows where water flows. So if our natural resources are becoming more limited, that means that our food is becoming more limited. And this bill, SB 108, is looking to making sure that as a society, as a human race, we are food secure because, as you know, in today's drought, land is being fallowed. Well, we don't know really what land is being fallowed or what crops are being fallowed or what does that mean when it comes to food and how that applies to our meals and our food banks and our programs, right? We can have all the money in the world for programs to fund food, but if there is no food, then we have a problem. So SB 108 looks towards the future and how food is going to be impacted because of climate change and more limited water, and making sure that we all still continue to have an adequate amount of food.
Considering the human right to food, it sounds a little bit esoteric. How do you make government reflexively think about human rights to food?
By sponsoring a piece of legislation and start having that conversation. Because I think this bill is, okay, well, human right to food, I mean, okay, that sounds good, but it's so much more complex than
Yes.
that, right?
Yes.
And we need to start having those conversations, and we need to start thinking about how we're all going to survive in a climate changing world. And quite frankly, SB 464 as well, it's a human right. We all have a human right to food.
Yes.
How can we deny some individuals food? It's a basic fundamental need for survival.
Well, you also bring up a good point in that as the drought, God forbid, gets worse and more farms go fallow, the whole overall product that we export diminishes. And then it becomes something that affects not just undocumented Californians, but Californians across the state. The potential domino effect of this is just as serious.
Yes, it's like scary serious, actually, which is why I've been so focused in these areas and trying to raise the concern and the issues, because quite frankly, there's studies out there that are showing that California will be able to produce 1/3 less than what we're able to produce today due to climate change by 2050. And the amount of water that we'll have available to produce food and fresh water to even like take a shower or to flush the toilet. And so we have to start rethinking and reimagining the way that we currently see not only just food, but also what grows food, which is also water. It's becoming more limited. And the last thing we want to do is create shortages of food and shortages of water. And that is what is happening now. And it's not just a Central Valley issue. This is a California issue. This
Indeed.
is a national issue.
Indeed.
This is a global issue, because what you're seeing is not just happening here. Although we do export food to the world, we also import a lot of food from throughout the world.
Mm-hmm.
And the drought crisis that we're facing here, it's the same crisis that other countries are facing through other parts of the world that we, import food from. We've seen farmers protesting in Germany, farmers protesting in India. We know that Latin America is having some challenges when it comes to crops. So this is a very scary situation, and that's part of the reason why the human right to food is something that I felt like needed to move forward. That we couldn't wait to have this conversation 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now, because we need to start taking action now. And I worry for our future, and I worry about not taking the right policy actions to prevent this. Famine is not just real in some faraway land.
Right.
Famine could be very
right
real
down the
here.
highway. Yes.
Right here.
You mentioned about worrying about the future. It reminds me what we talked about at the banks of the canal a year or so ago, when we talked about how water challenges and access to water kept you up at night. So I imagine this is one of those other issues that can easily keep you up at night too.
It sure does. I get very little sleep.
We need to get this dear senator some sleep and resolve some of these issues.
But like I said earlier as well, the people of the Central Valley keep me motivated and energize me, because honestly, they're relying on me. Mm-hmm. But I'm relying on them too, because I need their voices. I need them to continue to inspire me and to share stories, because this is just a reality that's been happening, and food insecurity and water insecurity in our region. But quite frankly, it's something that it's going to become real for a lot more families throughout this nation.
An allied component of the conquering food insecurity is your effort to promote a universal basic income for Valley farm workers, which would directly and indirectly put needed cash into the hands of many of these impoverished residents and workers in the Valley that we've talked about. And Governor Newsom, in his 2021 budget proposal, allocated $35 million to fund UBI pilot programs administered by local city or county governments. You have written a letter to the governor asking him to expand the program to farm workers. Obviously, UBI is not new, but a direct expansion of the program to a specific population like the farm workers, that's a pretty novel idea. What's the status of the proposal?
Well, we know it's in the budget, and there's approved funding for it. It's just a matter of how it is the program is being implemented. I know that cities and counties would be allowed to come up with their own pilots that would establish guaranteed basic income, and I'm pushing and having conversations, because it's also a sell not just to the governor or to the legislature or to the public. It's also a sell that I have to really make to the elected officials of the Central Valley, because they're not necessarily in support of this type of concept, but I think that if there's any industry that we need to be investing in first is our agricultural workers. We've been talking about creating better opportunities and better wages for farm workers for a very long time, and we have the opportunity to do that. And I think that the UBI is a program that is just desperately needed, and we need to really invest in our farm workers. They provide us our food. They make us food secure. We need to make them food secure, and UBI is a way to make that happen. I really want to emphasize to the governor's office, the governor, to the world, that as a world, as people, as a human race, we really need to be investing in those that keep us alive. Food keeps us alive, and they have one of the most difficult jobs out there, and we could do always a better job at making sure that they get paid more, and we could always do a better job at making sure that when natural disasters like a drought occur, that they are still protected and secured. So I hope that I'm making the right pitch to convince individuals, to convince elected officials, but it's these conversations that we need to have, and through podcasts, through one-on-ones, until we accomplish some good stuff for good people. Despite,
I guess, your urgent human rights focused warnings about food insecurity in immigrant communities, and notwithstanding what we've already talked about here, the domino effect and the potential that this can cascade into other communities and other parts of California and the world, just beyond undocumented residents, there's still some government colleagues that you have out there at both the legislative and the local government level who still believe that giving this kind of aid to undocumented residents and workers, and yes, just giving food, it's still a luxury item that even with a flush state budget, but especially as we still try to come out from under the pandemic and recover from pandemic-related problems like unemployment of the millions of workers here in California, that the state can't afford to, and the word I had heard was dump its priorities and funds into this kind of thing right now. What do you say to those folks that say we have to be still more particular about where our money's going?
Well, when it comes to SB 464 and investing these dollars in our most vulnerable communities and to our undocumented communities, I'd say this is the right investment because, we have, a community that is making sure that we are being fed. And this is something that it shouldn't be about us versus them and who benefits or who doesn't. Or look, the reality is that the UBI program, the SB 464, this is going to benefit all Californians, not just farm workers, not just the undocumented.
Right.
It's a good policy for the state of California to pursue, period.
And I suppose to some degree you also have an education element of this that you have to get out there. I reflected about this during the pandemic, and I think we should still focus on it now. People go to the grocery store, and there's all this fresh produce that really has not diminished. We saw more toilet paper shortages than we did food shortages during the pandemic. Most people give zero thought to where that food comes from or what sweat brought it from the branch or the vine to the produce section. And we don't want to be reminded of that suffering and sacrifice. It's just like, I don't want to hear the stories. Just let me buy my food. Let me get the food. And that attitude itself is kind of a metaphor for a lot of the problems in our country and state right now. But what do you say to that convincing or helping people understand that they have a role in this and they have a part of this impact too?
We all have a role in trying to understand individuals and ideas better. And we shouldn't necessarily always just have, I know that I always try to be open-minded even to things that maybe I originally disagree with. And honestly, UBI is something that I first was like, I don't know if this is a good idea to move forward. And I had to kind of, think about it a little bit more personally and challenge myself and see the good that can come out of it. And I'd say that, and what I've been telling individuals about UBI, about SB 464, is that these are good policies, that this shouldn't be partisan policies because they are not. They are human policies. They are policies that are aimed to do well for people. And SB 464, it's, as I tell people, this should be good for farm workers and for farmers, as should be UBI. This is something that's going to benefit farmers and farm workers. It's going to benefit communities because food insecurity is connected into health, but also connected to wealth, right? If the more insecure you are when it comes to your pocketbook, then the more challenges you have when it comes to everything else.
Legislatively, as we speak, you've moved these bills out of the Senate. They passed the Senate. They're on their way to the Assembly and to the policy committees there. So you've got more of a legislative process here to go. But so far, are you getting the positive feedback and the votes from your legislative colleagues on this?
Yes.
Are they hearing your urgency?
I don't know about the urgency part, but I know that they're definitely hearing and they're being supportive, and I'm very thankful to all of them for hearing me out. And ultimately, we're all in this together. And so I'm really trying to really show how food insecurity is very real.
Right.
And now more than ever, not just for our undocumented community, although they historically have been at a disadvantage by being left out of these programs. And that's just something that we can no longer tolerate, right? But food insecurity and, as I said, famine is not just something that is in some faraway land. It's something that is very real to all Californians.
You have put your heart and soul into this clarion call about food insecurity, as you've done with drought relief and water insecurity. You say you want to hear from the folks in the Valley. It sounds like you are. Are people listening to you? Are they understanding from their hearts, their gut, their appetite about their own feelings of what it's like to be hungry or thirsty, and are they projecting that out and willing to make change?
I would say yes. I've had conversations with people that have just opinions that are completely opposite of mine, and we have conversations. And the thing that I love about the Central Valley is that we respect each other's ideas, no matter how extreme they can be. We listen to one another, and sometimes we agree to disagree, but sometimes we agree. And I'm beginning to see some of that, and I'm sure that the more conversations, the more agreement we'll have throughout the region. And if there's any disagreement throughout the rest of the state of California, we'll make our way through, because this is something that is good for all. We're all in this together, as you said earlier.
Well, that is what we will take moving forward here. Thank you so much for coming by to talk again. It's good to see you in person, and I hope to get back out to your district and see more of it through your eyes and soul, because I think it's those personal projections and perceptions and narrative that really make a difference when it comes down to these policies and these legislative proposals. So I look forward to seeing you again, and good luck with Comida para
Thank
Todos.
you, Brian. We'd love to have you down in the Central Valley sometime soon.
I will come back down.
We're looking forward to it. We'll
take a tour with you.
We'll take you down to the Frying Kern Canal, and then we'll teach you how to pick grapes.
I would love that. I'm kind of becoming fond of that Frying Kern Canal at this point. So.
Okay.
Thank you very much for that. Good
you.
luck with everything. State Senator Melissa Hurtado. And that is a wrap for this edition of Then There's California. It's a production of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus, with technical assistance and great ideas and support from Martin Ashley, Bob Brulte, Brian Shadden, and Rainier Saviniano, Gunjan Patel, McLena Woods, Lisa Murphy, Ricardo Sainz Ione, and the graphic design talents of Tim Davis. On behalf of State Senator Melissa Hurtado of the Central Valley, representing California's 14th Senate District and the heart of that valley, I'm Brian Green from the state capitol in Sacramento. Thanks for listening to Then There's California.